So welcome to the 10-minute tutorial series, a series of, clue is in the title, 10-minute tutorials on the A-level French Revolution course. Doesn't matter whether you are doing AQA, an Excel or OCR, this is the series of mini tutorials for you. Very important, go to myhistorytutor.com, website there. You can get yourself a copy of the A-level textbook that accompanies this series. So what we talk about in the tutorials, we expand in great depth in the book. So make sure you go there. All right, let's get started with the lesson. So then we come to the period of late June and early July. And tensions in Paris in particular are running very high. Okay, because of the rioting, Louis decides that he's going to bring troops into Paris. And now this is a pretty inflammatory move because a lot of people think these troops are about to try and crush the emerging revolution. Essentially going to try and crush the new National Assembly. On the 11th of July, Necker is sacked. His announcement was not. The announcement of his sacking was not made until the 12th of July, but he's sacked on the 11th of July. Now, Necker is very popular with the people. Remember, Jacques Necker is the finance minister at this time. Necker is not a nobleman. Necker is a wealthy banker, Swiss banker, but he's not a nobleman, and he's perceived as, if you like, one of us, one of the people, although in reality he was probably much wealthier than many of the nobles that he was clashing swords with. But Necker is sacked by Louis. So what you have is the perception at this time that Louis is getting ready to initiate a counterattack, essentially to crush the revolution. He sacked the reformist pro-people finance minister, Necker, and he suddenly moved troops into Paris. So this picture we've got here is a guy called Camille, if I can bring it back, there it is, of Camille Desmoulins. Okay, Desmoulins was a journalist and a sort of firebrand revolutionary. He was actually one of those pretty quickly that begins to move towards a sort of republican position to end the monarchy. And here we have Desmoulins in central Paris on the 12th of July making a speech to the people, basically saying, go and arm yourself. Find the weapons. We think that Louis's troops are about to attack and try and crush the National Assembly. So he kind of whips up thousands of people in Paris demanding that they all go and arm themselves and get ready to sort of counter this potential government attack. So what do? Well, they attack the Bastille. Okay, there it is in the background. I think we've got, if I go back, there he is, yeah. So they attack the Bastille, okay? There you can see a picture of it. So the Bastille was a prison, a very big building on the kind of outskirts of Paris. It's a little bit like the Tower of London in London, and it's where predominantly political prisoners, stuff that the king, people that the king didn't like, usually ended up in the Bastille. Everybody knew where it was, everybody knew what it was. It was absolutely a symbol of the regime. It was a symbol of the kind of the ancien regime that people detested and feared. Now, in an exam, if you're asked to talk about the fall of the Bastille in terms of its significance, it's very important to realise that the reason that it was attacked was not particularly because it was, a sort of symbolic attack on the regime, that they wanted to make a statement. The ordinary people wanted to make a statement by sort of saying, we're going to undermine your power base by attacking this prison. That's not really what it was about. Remember that Desmoulins had said, and others had said, look, go and arm yourselves. We need you to have weapons in case the king tries to attack. And on the 13th, this sort of mob of people, thousands of people, were ransacking buildings trying to find weapons. And they didn't find many. So on the 14th of July, they attacked the Bastille. The reason that they attacked it was because it had weapons and, crucially, gunpowder. They needed gunpowder. So it was well known that the Bastille was an arsenal as much as it was a prison. In fact, there were only about 7 prisoners in there at the time. So it wasn't really, that is actually an indication that the regime was actually relatively tolerant. They didn't lock up thousands and thousands of people, unlike, for example, a Stalinist Russia or Hitler's Germany. Um, I'm not going to say that Louis' regime was tolerant. There was considerable censorship, but you'd be pretty unlucky to get yourself locked up, particularly in the Bastille. So they attacked it because they wanted gunpowder and guns. It was a pretty bloody affair. Several the important people in the Bastille were killed, including the governor of the prison, hacked to death, and the governor's head was stuck on a pipe and paraded through the streets of Paris, which is obviously pretty brutal. But if we have a look at this cartoon, actually both of these cartoons, look at the contrast between the two cartoons. So if we look at the one on the left-hand side, it doesn't take a genius to work out the symbolism of this cartoon, that this poor old chap, you can see he's carrying some kind of spade or shovel or something like that. So he's clearly a member of the third estate, and then these two that's obviously a noblesse d'épée, you can tell, because he's got a sword. Remember, épée is the French word for sword. And he's also carrying a member of the clergy. So that's a pre-revolutionary cartoon, and it's pretty obvious, what the imagery there is. And contrast that with this cartoon here. So this is immediately after the fall of the Bastille. You can see the Bastille in the background, and if you look very, very carefully, you can see there's some pictures there of people with picks and shovels dismantling the Bastille. And that's actually what they did. They took it apart brick by brick to sort of symbolize the end of the Ancien Regime. But the important thing to note is this, what's going on here. So here we got a member of the third estate, there's the clergy, and then again it's the noblesse d'épée, a nobleman. You've got the third estate member who's thrown off his shackles. There is shackles, look, you can see the chains. And look what he's doing. He's reaching for, this is a rifle here, and you can see there's a pistol. And on the end of the rifle there's what looks like a sword or a dagger or something like that. So he's reaching for a sword or some weaponry. Okay, and look at the reaction of the members of the second and third estate. That's not, oh, this is terrific news. The third estate are finally free. No. These are two very scared people because they realise that the third estate is now free, armed, and dangerous. Okay, so when it says here at the top, Réveil du tiers état, that literally means the awakening of the third estate. So everybody understood the fall of the Bastille, though there wasn't too much sort of material gain. They got some weapons and gunpowder, but there was, a real significance to it because this was the moment, really, that the Ancien Regime ended, because the power had shifted to the third estate. Okay, so now we move into what's called the Great Fear. So this was a period of a few weeks from kind of mid to late July to early August. And it was really driven by two things. It was driven by the expectation that any minute Louis was going to potentially try and crush the counter revolution with his troops. Now, after the fall of the Bastille, Louis actually orders his troops in Paris to pull back outside of Paris. So the Bastille was significant. The falling of the Bastille was significant because not only the symbolism of the Bastille being attacked and taken down, the attack on the Ancien regime, Louis Louis's troops in Paris do nothing. They don't raise a hand to try and defend the Bastille, and therefore, by extension, to defend the Ancien regime. So everybody knows this. Everybody knows that Louis's power is effectively broken down. So Louis asks the troops to just pull out of Paris. And it's a sort of symbolic withdrawal of Louis's power as the troops leave Paris. But there's still this ongoing belief that at any minute Louis might try and get them to attack the revolutionaries. So that's the first part of the Great Fear. The second part was this so-called famine plot, which is about food shortages. There were still really bad food shortages. Prices were still very high, and people were convinced that the nobility were in some kind of giant plot to try and starve the people, literally starve them back into line. Basically, unless you stop misbehaving, you stop this silly National Assembly malarkey, which is not going to release any food. They believed it was plot. It wasn't anything of the kind. There was just terrible. Um, there had been a really poor harvest. And there'd been further problems even into July. There'd been hailstorms which had destroyed crops in July 1789. So there wasn't any great, there wasn't any great conspiracy, but that didn't matter because people thought there was. So there was this great fear, and as a result of that, we start to see law and order breaking down across the rest of the country as symbols of feudalism were attacked. So the symbols of feudalism were not just the fact that the manor houses that these nobles lived in, but it was the wine presses that they owned, the mills that they owned, the outhouses that they owned where they stored food. All these things that were symbols of the feudal regime. You remember, the so-called banalities. The banalities were um, you were forced if you were living on feudal lands. You were even if you owned that land, you were forced to use the Lord's wine press if you wanted to make alcohol, which was quite common. If you wanted to make bread, remember how important bread was. You had to use the Lord's mill. You had to pay to do so. So these were symbols of the feudal regime, and they were attacked right across France. So law and order begins to break down, not just in Paris. Remember the riots attacking bakers' shops, but they start spreading across France. Okay, this is in response to this great fear, this great panic that's breaking out. So why is that important? Well, it's enormously important because of what happens next. The August decrees. Okay, so in August the 6th, 1789, the National Assembly, as it now calls itself, um, it tries to do two things. It's really worried about the general law and order breaking down across the country. So it issues a series of decrees essentially to abolish feudalism. Okay, the structure of society that had governed France for centuries was basically abolished overnight. And you can see the wording taken from the August Decree. The feudal system is entirely abolished. All feudal rights and dues, as well as personal servitude, are abolished with no compensation. Okay, so this was a huge move, huge move. And they did it partly to try and calm tensions in France, to say to people, look, don't worry, we're here to help. we are your representative body, and this is the first thing we're going to do to help. We're going to abolish feudalism. But also, they're doing it also to try and stamp then the National Assembly's authority. They're trying to make a statement. Look, we are this new organisation, and we are in charge. Okay, and that's why we decree that feudalism is dead. So, what did they actually abolish? Well, tithes gone straight away. Remember, payment of money to the church that pretty much everybody that owned land had to pay. Gone. All seigneurial rights gone. So even if you owned your own land, which the majority of peasants did do, they literally owned their own land, they still had all sorts of feudal obligations. So the banalities, which you've just talked about, they had to use the lord's mills if they wanted to make bread, or the wine press if they wanted to make alcohol. The corvée, they had to offer free labour to their feudal lord to fix his roads and other walls and outhouses on his property. Had to do that for several days every year. There were restrictions on what crops they could grow. Even if they owned their own property, there were still the restrictions. They had to get the permission from their feudal lord if they wanted to grow different crops. There were feudal dues. So this meant they had to pay some money every year to the feudal lord, even if they owned their own land. So imagine if you owned your own house or you owned your own car, and you then had to pay somebody else some money for the privilege of owning that. You would be a bit peeved. There were also, and this was a big one that we see in the cahiers that were written 6 months before, hunting rights. The feudal lord still had the right to go hunting on your property, even though you owned it. Of course, this was terrible for a small landholder because it could not potentially kill their own cattle, but crucially kill any crops they're trying to grow. If they got dozens of horses and dogs chasing through their land, it was terrible for them. So at a stroke, all that gone. Also, serfdom, a fundamental part of feudalism. Serfdom was dying out, so there wasn't much of it around in France at the time. It pretty much died out across most of Europe. But there was still a small residue of people that were serfs, i.e. they were people that didn't own any land. They had to work full time for the feudal lord, and they were greatly restricted in what they could do. They couldn't just travel where they wanted. They couldn't marry who they wanted. They had to get permissions from the feudal lord. Serfdom, gone. Manorial courts also gone. So, if you like, the local courts that were always run by feudal lords disbanded. All the tax exemptions that the nobility were given, gone. And so, did we see the abolition of the nobility? Well, not quite. Okay, they were kneecapped in the sense that their feudal rights had gone, but the nobility as a class, as a concept in terms of titles, still existed.
Okay, that is enough for today. So thank you again for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Very busy and significant period in French history has just been covered. As ever, make sure you like the video, add a comment if you want to ask a question or you need some help with your homework. Next lesson, we're going to look at the Declaration of Human Rights and the October Days. That's basically where Louis gets dragged, metaphorically kicking and screaming, from Versailles back into Paris. Don't forget, myhistorytutor.com has got the world's greatest ever book. You can go to the website, get yourself a copy, and you will probably get a very good grade if you read it.